At 70 years old, she had spent nearly 2 years asking, gently, and then somewhat less gently, for her only son to visit her new life in the Philippines, a request he had repeatedly deferred, citing work obligations and his young children's school schedules, reasons she had accepted as genuine, even while privately suspecting something less straightforward beneath them. When he finally arrived for a planned 10-day visit that ultimately concluded after 4, she found herself, once his rescheduled flight had departed, sitting alone in her apartment, experiencing a specific and genuinely disorienting relief that she immediately recognized as something she needed to examine honestly, rather than simply feel guilty about and move past. This is her story, told with genuine care, about a visit that revealed considerably more than either of them had anticipated, and why, despite everything that follows, she does not actually regret it occurring the way it did. She had relocated to the Philippines at 68, following her husband's death 2 years earlier, a decision she had made with what she described as genuine confidence and clarity at the time, motivated by both the specific financial relief a lower cost of living provided relative to her modest fixed income, and a deliberate desire to build a genuinely new chapter, rather than remaining in a house and community saturated with shared memory. Her son, 43 years old and established in his own career and family life several states away, had expressed what she characterized, in retrospect, as a carefully measured and somewhat performed support for her decision at the time, language she recognized only later as concealing a considerably more complicated set of feelings he had not, during her original departure, felt able or willing to articulate directly. The specific tensions that eventually surfaced during his visit, she wanted to note, had not been entirely invisible before his arrival, existing instead as a kind of low background static she had noticed across their video calls over her 2 years abroad, but had, by her own honest admission, chosen not to address directly, preferring the more comfortable path of assuming distance and busy schedules explained whatever slight edge she occasionally detected in his voice, or whatever topics he seemed to consistently redirect away from during their regular conversations. Before we get into what actually happened during his visit, subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell. Every week on this channel, we share real, honest stories of Americans starting over overseas. Not the polished version, the honest one. Subscribe now so you never miss one. The visit's difficulty, she wanted to be direct, had not announced itself immediately. His first 2 days involving what she genuinely experienced as warm and largely comfortable reconnection, touring her neighborhood, meeting several of the local friends and community connections she had built, interactions that had seemed, at the time, to be going considerably better than her private anxieties beforehand had prepared her to expect. The specific shift began during their 3rd day, during what she had intended as a particularly meaningful visit to a local senior center, where she volunteered several mornings weekly, an activity she had specifically wanted to share with him, given how significantly it had come to structure both her practical daily life and her broader sense of purpose since her relocation. She wanted to describe the specific moment with genuine detail, because she felt the general summary, that he became upset, did not adequately capture what had actually occurred or why it had affected her as significantly as it ultimately did. While observing her interact with several of the elderly Filipino residents she had grown close to through her volunteer work, warmly greeting them by name, helping coordinate a specific activity with practiced familiarity, her son had grown visibly quiet, a silence she had initially misread as simple observation before he finally spoke, his voice carrying a specific rawness she had not previously heard from him as an adult, asking her directly whether these women he had known for less than an hour, actually knew her, genuinely knew her, in the way he felt she had stopped allowing him to know her since her move, or whether what he was witnessing was simply a more performed version of the same emotional distance he said he had felt from her throughout most of the 2 years since she had left. She wanted to be honest that her immediate response had been defensive rather than reflective, a specific reaction she has since had considerable time to examine and regret, having responded to what she now recognizes was a genuinely vulnerable and painful admission from her son, with what amounted to a recitation of her various community activities and connections, evidence, she had believed at the time, that directly contradicted his accusation of emotional distance, a response that had, predictably in retrospect, though she had not recognized it in the moment, produced exactly the opposite of the reassurance she had intended, her son withdrawing further rather than feeling heard, the remainder of that particular day passing in a strained and largely silent tension, neither of them directly addressed again until considerably later. The following day, their fourth and what became their final full day together before his rescheduled departure, had involved what she described as a difficult but ultimately more genuinely productive conversation than their initial exchange. Though she wanted to be direct that productive, in this specific context, did not mean comfortable or fully resolved. He had, during a walk along the same coastal boulevard she regularly frequented, articulated more directly what had underlain his earlier observation, a specific grief, distinct from and in some ways more difficult to name than straightforward anger, regarding his father's death and her subsequent relocation, occurring in what felt, to him, like an uncomfortably compressed sequence, his own grief for his father having barely begun processing before his mother had, from his perspective, essentially disappeared into an entirely new life on the other side of the world, a life he genuinely believed made her happier, a fact that he found, he admitted with visible difficulty, genuinely hard to reconcile with his own continued grief, creating a specific and uncomfortable guilt about resenting his mother's evident contentment during a period when his own grief for his father remained genuinely unresolved. She wanted to be honest about how significantly this specific admission had reframed her understanding of the entire visit's difficulty, recognizing, upon genuine reflection rather than immediate defensive reaction, that her son's apparent criticism of her community connections had actually reflected something considerably more complicated than simple jealousy or disapproval of her new life. A genuine and unprocessed grief that her own relocation, however individually sound and genuinely beneficial to her own well-being, had inadvertently complicated by removing her physical presence during precisely the period when he most needed to process his own loss, alongside someone who had shared it, his father's death mattering to her in a way it could not matter to anyone in her new Philippine community, regardless of how genuinely warm and meaningful those newer relationships had become. She wanted to address directly why, despite the genuine pain and difficulty this conversation and the visit's early departure produced, she did not ultimately regret it occurring, a distinction she felt mattered considerably to an honest account of her experience. The visit, however difficult, had surfaced a genuine and previously unaddressed grief and resentment that had been quietly accumulating across 2 years of surface-level video calls, a pattern she recognized, with the benefit of subsequent reflection, would likely have continued indefinitely without the specific and uncomfortable catalyst of his direct in-person observation of her new life, an accumulation that she believed would have eventually produced considerably more serious and permanent damage to their relationship had it continued unaddressed, rather than surfacing, however painfully, during his actual visit. The specific relief she had felt watching his departing flight, she wanted to clarify honestly, had reflected not genuine happiness that the visit had ended badly, but a specific and, she came to recognize, entirely understandable relief at no longer needing to actively manage the particular emotional intensity and unresolved tension that had characterized their final 2 days together, a relief she distinguished carefully from any desire that the visit and the difficult conversation it had ultimately produced had never occurred at all. In the months since his departure, their relationship had required what she described as considerably more deliberate and honest ongoing communication than their previous 2 years of comfortable but genuinely surface-level video calls had involved, including a specific and, by her account, genuinely difficult conversation conducted roughly 6 weeks after his visit, during which she had directly acknowledged the validity of his grief and the genuine complexity her relocation had introduced into his own grieving process. An acknowledgement she wanted to note had not involved any suggestion that her decision to relocate had been wrong, but rather a genuine recognition that a decision could be simultaneously sound for her own well-being and genuinely difficult for someone she loved. Two things she had, before his visit, not fully allowed herself to hold as equally true and equally worthy of acknowledgement. When asked what she would tell another parent considering a significant relocation following the loss of a spouse, particularly regarding how to navigate the specific grief dynamics with adult children that her own experience had revealed, her answer focused specifically on the danger of assuming surface-level, comfortable communication accurately reflects genuine emotional processing, recommending direct and repeated inquiry into how a specific relocation decision is actually affecting an adult child's own grief process, rather than accepting the kind of carefully measured, superficially supportive language her own son had initially offered as evidence that no deeper difficulty existed beneath it. If you are watching this and are considering or have already made a significant relocation following the loss of a spouse, with adult children who have offered measured, seemingly supportive responses to your decision, she wanted to leave you with the specific reframe her own difficult visit had eventually produced. Comfortable, surface-level support from an adult child navigating their own grief alongside your relocation does not necessarily indicate the absence of genuine, unprocessed difficulty beneath it, and a direct, uncomfortable conversation, initiated deliberately rather than waiting for circumstances to force it as painfully as her own son's visit ultimately did, may prevent considerable accumulated resentment and distance from developing in a relationship that matters too much to risk losing to nothing more than the accumulated weight of unaddressed and increasingly distant video calls. Subscribe to Second Life Abroad and turn on the notification bell. Share this with someone you know who has relocated abroad following a loss and might benefit from having a more direct conversation with the adult children navigating their own grief alongside that decision. We will see you in the next one. There is a specific practical step she wanted to include, one that emerged directly from a conversation with a grief counselor she had begun seeing, somewhat reluctantly at her son's suggestion, in the months following his visit, because she felt it offered something more concrete and replicable than simply the general recommendation to have more honest conversations. The counselor had suggested a specific practice she now recommends directly to anyone navigating a similar dynamic, establishing a recurring, explicitly designated conversation, separate from regular catching-up video calls, specifically dedicated to checking in on how the relocation and the shared loss were each actually being processed and experienced by both parties, rather than allowing that specific and significant topic to remain permanently embedded within, and therefore easily avoided during, more general weekly conversations about grandchildren, work, and other comfortable daily topics that naturally crowded out space for the harder discussion neither of them had been initiating independently. She and her son now maintain a monthly call specifically framed around this purpose, an arrangement that had felt, she admitted, somewhat artificial and uncomfortable during their first several attempts, requiring a level of directness neither had genuinely practiced throughout most of their relationship, but which had, over the following year, produced what she described as a considerably more honest and current understanding of each other's actual emotional experience than their previous 2 years of comfortable avoidance had ever provided. A specific structural solution she credited as much as any single insight from the original difficult visit itself with actually sustaining the more honest relationship that visit had ultimately, if painfully, initiated.